So those of you in the real audience, this is going to be slightly awkward because we're going to talk as if I would just do this totally chit-chatty if it was just this many people. But since we're recording, we'll be a little bit more formal, and then we can have Q&A. Sam, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So Brian and I met yesterday just to chat and look over some stuff. So I'm just going to talk for like 5 minutes about just some general, best practices for publishing in grad school. And these are not, meant to be laws of nature or things you must abide by, just kind of things that I feel lead to success. And, certainly some of them will be controversial in some respect or other. And I can email this to people if they would like. This is just my unceremonious note sheet in bullets. So the first thing I want to say is just this advice is advice for the job market as it is, not necessarily as it should be. And I think that in terms of getting a job, publishing is obviously a practical reality. And sometimes that sets up an incentive to work on something that you not necessarily don't like or don't think is worth pursuing, but there will be times if your goal is publication for the purpose of getting a job that you need to like set aside the desire to, read the umpteenth article about topic X that really interests you, or maybe pick a topic to research that is more, timely and relevant or something like that. And sometimes that's at odds with the goal of being a perfect philosopher and, seeking truth at all times, but it's a practical reality. So there are just kind of 6 rules that I try to follow. One is to submit a lot, write a lot, and start early. So in year 5 or so of the PhD, publications aren't going to just appear. I started submitting things in year 1 with, varying levels of failure. And I was telling Brian yesterday that I submitted my graduate school writing sample about the problem of induction to the British Journal for Philosophy of Science. And I was all like, oh man, they don't want my writing sample? What? And that was maybe a little too precocious. But I think getting in the mentality and the mindset of submitting things a lot, I aim to have at least 3 things under review at all times because it's a numbers game. And the more things you have out, the higher the chances of a return. And this is something Brian reminded me of yesterday, to not publish in shit journals. And what I mean by that is like, I think one thing I didn't know at the start of grad school was having 20 publications that are all in like, sorry, just to like pick on a journal, not trying to pick on this journal in particular, but I'll just say it like Southwest Philosophy Review or, some random like okay mid-tier journal.
I'll name some names in my part, Sam. So you don't have to name names now.
I think that probably looks worse to people than having fewer publications in good places. And I think that's hard because grad students often don't know what are the good journals and the bad journals. I think our department has a really nice document for ranking things. I also think the polls on the Leiter report are pretty helpful. Okay, idea number 2, treat every seminar paper as a publication. So I always tried to find ways to fit my own research or something I thought was a publishable idea into the seminar and to write my paper about that. And a lot of faculty are fine with that and some are not. And I just found, being honest with people about that. Like actually, I remember Brian didn't want me to write my paper about the topic I wanted to write about, and that was fine. And we just, established that. But whenever people would let me do it, I would try to like steer the course material toward my own research. And I didn't mean that as like a pigeonhole thing. Like Brian and I were joking yesterday about like how weird would it be to research, consent in early modern philosophy with emphasis on Margaret Cavendish or something like that. That would be weird. Maybe that'd be cool. I don't know. But as much as you can, try to make that work do 2 things at once for you. Oh yeah, Alex just put these up. Yeah. And I also found that the pro seminar in values in particular was a great chance to get 4 conference papers because the papers are all about conference length. They're all about 3,500 words, I believe. And they're often, especially for people like David Boonen's section of the course, they're often about very contemporary things. So I think, yeah, the papers from that class, I ended up submitting several of those for conferences. Okay, number 3, I think to learn to be okay with a lot of rejection. So I think that as someone who's published a decent number of articles, I can say definitively that I have never had an article accepted the first place it was sent to. Maybe like once, but like not at a good journal. And I think that some papers of mine have been rejected more than 5 times. I think that the absolute best piece of writing I've ever done has been rejected like 7 times, and I'm running out of places to submit it to, but in my mind, it is the best thing I've ever written. So everyone else is wrong. But the point being, you're going to get rejected a lot. I really like, this was on Daily News a few years back. I've never heard of this person. This is a political science professor at McGill who does political theory, but he posted his CV of rejections, and you can scroll down it. If you just Google CV of rejections, it's the first thing that comes up. And you can see how it's subjective. Some stuff that he has that got rejected at, not that great places gets accepted at like really good places. But also you can see how many times all of his stuff has been rejected. Like this paper that came out in Phil Imprint was rejected all these times. So I think stuff like that is valuable to keep in mind, that even the best people encounter those problems. Okay. And okay, I'll wrap this up pretty quickly. So number 4, I would say take the advice of referees seriously, but know that they aren't God. So I think that there are 2 vices. One is referees are dumb, don't listen to anything they say. The other is, oh my gosh, the referee said this footnote should be formatted differently, I must do this. And I think both are wrong. And I think that you're a better judge than someone who read your paper once is of like what really needs to be changed. But also they're an expert in the field that the journal presumably selected because of their expertise. So I think just bear both of those things in mind and change the things that you actually think make the paper better, and ignore the things that you don't think make the paper better. How do you determine which is which? That's obviously difficult, and that's where the rub is. And I guess just one anecdote, there was a paper a few years back that was submitted to RMPC that myself and another person refereed, and we both just thought it was kind of meh. And it got in, and I commented on it, and like the audience didn't really like it that much. And I later saw on this person's website that the paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Philosophy. And this was years later, right? So I'm sure many changes had been made. And for all I know, this paper was brilliant and I'm dumb. That's obviously within the realm of possibility. But the point is, one person's okay enough for our grad student conference to another person is, in a few years, admit this to the Journal of Philosophy. Okay, so number 5, don't spend too much time on non-research tasks. And this, I think, is where it becomes most apparent I'm giving advice for the job market as it is. So I think obviously being a good teacher is very important. I care a lot about being a good teacher. I want to be a very good teacher. But I think that at the margins, if your goal is to get a job, spending the nth hour on teaching versus spending the nth hour on researching, it's much more valuable to spend that nth hour on teaching. And I spend a lot of time working on my courses, but I often assign things I haven't read in advance when I know they make the point that I want, the class to receive. And sometimes I'm really surprised by like, oh, that author says this in this paper. Whoops, I didn't mean for them to say that, but it always works out. And Brian will disagree with that, I'm sure. But
I want to jump in here really quickly. I think teaching is also very important, but at the margins thing is really, really important. Like I will see these long discussions in the teaching groups on Facebook that I'm part of about like radically revising your approach to grading and completely upending all of university education. I'm like, sweet, I'm glad somebody's thinking about that. But that is not where you should be putting your attention. Like there are things that like work pretty well in teaching philosophy for most people most of the time. You can do that. That stuff it takes some work. Then there are things where you're like, I don't know, that might work. That might totally, but how much more is it going to make a difference? I don't know. Is this massive? Like it would take all of your time, effort. And I will see people sometimes get obsessed. I've seen people I know get obsessed with like these weird things. I'm like, that is so much effort for who knows how much payout. And this is why like you want to like rationally allocate your effort toward like what's likely to actually be good for your students, but also what's actually going to be good for you. And I think it's really important to think about like, yeah, is the effort you're considering putting into your teaching actually going to have any likely tangible impact or enough? That's really important to think about.
Yeah, and I recall people who have long since left our grad program who were excellent teachers, but sometimes I got the impression that they were spending that extra Saturday on their teaching because they didn't want to work on their research and because they were putting it off. And it's always more rewarding to work on, well, often more rewarding to work on teaching and, thinking, oh, how can I change someone's life in the next class than it is like, oh, the fifth revision of this dumb paper I'm writing, whatever. Hopefully not a dumb paper. And yeah, this is another thing that I think is where the incentives of the job market and the incentives of being, Plato are not totally in line. I think reading widely is important, but I don't think we should approach reading and teaching and research as kind of we are an open book, come to us all the information of the world via osmosis. I'm a mercenary when I read. I try to do as much research as I can to understand the literature. And beyond that, I just want to be working on the paper. And I realize that's not like what I'm saying right now is not the most virtuous thing, but I think it's the most practical thing.
Dude, again, I'm glad you're saying it. I'm glad I don't have to say this because this is really important advice. Like, yeah, the life of the mind is really nice, but like again, as a professor, who's like active research projects, you also get to a point where you often don't have time to read very widely out of stuff that you're not going to work on. I mean, I have pretty wide interests and I work on a lot of weird stuff. But a lot of times it's like, I wouldn't know about something until someone gives a talk about it. And then I'm like, oh, I should look more into that. But like, I don't just like randomly read papers. I know people who are like, they're reading like every paper that comes out in Noose or whatever. I'm like, dude, I don't know how you could possibly fit that in. My reading does tend to focus on stuff that I think will be relevant to things I want to work on. Because I just there's not enough hours in the day to do that and to like do my actual research and to teach and also to have fun, which is also very important, by the way. So you shouldn't feel guilty if you're just not like randomly like paging through Wittgenstein. I mean, unless you work on Wittgenstein, if you're just like not like random, you don't have to like be the best possible philosopher in the world because you're probably not going to be. Sorry, that's probably the more pessimistic way to put it. But anyway, I just want to echo, Sam, that you shouldn't be embarrassed about that. That's very good advice. And this is how the vast majority of us have to live our lives.
And then just the last thing I would say is just seek a lot of advice from people on your papers, and CU people I think are really great at giving feedback. When I was a first year grad student, I had mentors in the fifth year who worked in the same area. So I used to send papers to Alex Imbrano and Cheryl Abate a lot, and they always gave me really great feedback. And then also, having I think maybe courage is the right word initially to send papers to your advisors or people who you want to work with. And it can be nerve-wracking, but I think just having a thick skin, like I won't name the professors at CU who have given me just brutal feedback, but it was all in the service of making me better. And I appreciated it as much as it sometimes was painful to read. And even to this day, like some people who have read everything I've ever written at CU still give me just this, but it's all to make you better. And I think having that mindset. And then last thing I'll say is just I try to send stuff to non-CU people who work in that area. And I think that has a dual purpose. One is you build a network with people who work on your topic. And the other is that people who are working in that area will know your work. They may be the referee of your paper, but also they're experts on that field and they can give you comments one way or the other. In my experience, unless you're sending your paper to someone really famous or really mean, they will always at least say, hey, I'm busy right now. Can I get to this in a few months? But very often they'll give you just excellent feedback on what you're doing. And yeah, and I think many people have this feel like, oh, it would be intimidating if I emailed this person my paper on this thing they work on. Most of these people like will never meet anyone who works on what they work on, and they're excited if someone emails them and is like, oh my gosh, I'm interested in these obscure questions you're interested in. So that's my spiel, and that's all I have to say.
That last thing is great. I get nervous about talking to people who I actually know about philosophy and asking them, but like, it's really valuable to reach out to people and say, hey, could I ask you some questions or send you a draft? You know, don't send them stuff that's like, respect their time, right? You know, be like, oh, I dashed off these notes over the weekend. Can you read these 20 pages I wrote while I was high or whatever? Don't do that, obviously. But it doesn't have to be like the absolute finalist version either. And again, yeah, if you're emailing David Lewis, I think he's dead, but that's probably, you're overreaching. But like, people you're going to think are famous and have no time, they probably have a little bit of time. Famous for philosophy doesn't mean really famous. And so a lot of times, like, people who are like, you know, really respectable philosophers are super excited to hear people are interested in what they're interested in. So I sent a handout. I think Alex has distributed that. So there are two things that Alex distributed. One is a journal ranking document, which is what our department uses for merit evaluation of professors. So to determine like raises and stuff like that. I got, Julia's on the salary committee. I got her approval to share this with you. I crossed some stuff out in black. That stuff is not private. It's not anything bad. It's just, it was irrelevant and I didn't know how to delete it off the PDF. And so I just crossed it out in black, in black highlighter. And that just gives you a sense of the ranking, how our department thinks journals are ranked. 10 is best. And here, why don't we just take a look? I'll screen share and we take a look at that really quickly. First, I have to open the document. And then, here we go. The left column is book publishers, probably not relevant to you right now. And then these are just journals, and they're just alphabetical order. You can kind of think about this as like grading scale. 9 to 10 with what you might consider A-level journals. In the 8s, like B-level journals, and the 7s is like C-level journals. That's like very rough. I don't think I've heard of almost any of the ones that are like under 6. My rule of thumb would be, well, where I'm at in my life right now, I wouldn't submit anything that's below the C level, and probably I will, for my own personal submission, be more interested in B and A-level journals. But like, I wouldn't advise any of my advisees to submit anything below the C level. Maybe there's some that might be 6 on the scale that'd be like, okay, maybe. Anyway, I don't know. There's a million. Also, you notice there's a lot of philosophy journals. You can see there's a ton of these here. But you're going to want to focus. My advice would be, very generally, focus on B and maybe C-level journals. If you can send an A-level journal, it's great. I'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, I just want to say that you can take a look at that document on your own. Okay.
Wait, what's the scale again? Sorry, is 10?
10 is best.
10 is best. Okay, sorry. I was thinking it was the other way. So.
Yeah. So yes, please do not do it the other way. So yeah, 10 is best. 9 to 10 are the A-level journals, very roughly. Again, 8, 8.5 for the B-level journals, 7, 7.5 the C-level journals, very, very roughly. So that part of my talk, so I should say what I'm not going to talk about, what I am going to talk about. To me, this is mostly about like it's not going to be everything you want to know about publishing, because I don't have infinite time. But it's going to be, here's some things you might not know about publishing, and here's some guidelines, and then here's a kind of jumping off point. And I'll just kind of mention something right off the bat, which I'm going to come back to a million times. You need to be getting advice from other people about everything you're doing, because you don't know what you're doing, and you need other people to help you. This is true everywhere in philosophy. Philosophy is a social discipline for a reason. Almost nobody makes progress on their own, and this is nothing to be embarrassed about. And you need to get used to asking for advice. You need to ask for advice about what to work on, you need to get feedback on your papers. You need to get advice about where to submit. You need to get advice for like when to resubmit and stuff like that. Also, everything I'm saying is like very much like, first of all, get advice first, but I'm just going to give you some information that'll help you. Some of this is my opinion. Some of this is a little bit more factish. Okay, so I have a handout which will get distributed or has been distributed by Alex. And this is just kind of an overview, so you can take notes, and so you know what we covered, you can take notes on. So I'm not going to talk a lot about how to write good papers, although I will say a little bit about it. And most thing when I talk about how to write good papers, this is from the perspective of me as a referee. And I'll say, here's how I referee papers, and that will maybe be informative about how you can write better papers. Let's start with where to submit papers. Some of this is just kind of stuff you just should know, and some of you don't know. There are tiers of journals. We just went over that. A level, B level, C level. People talk like that all over the profession, by the way. Are these objectively better and worse? Probably not. I mean, we like to kid ourselves that they are. It doesn't matter. This is, even if it's all prestige, if you're thinking about getting a job, you need to think about prestige. There are generalist journals and there are specialty journals. Generalist journals will publish in a range of areas, although not every generalist journal will publish on every topic. For example, some generalist journals don't publish history stuff. Specialist or specialty journals publish only in a set area topics, only in ethics, only in epistemology, only in a particular aspect of history, for example. So the ranking that was distributed kind of ranks all the generalist and specialty journals together. This is all very complicated. This is a place where you need to get advice when you're thinking about submitting. Sometimes you're like, what I want, like, should I be publishing a B-level generalist journal or a B-level specialist journal? My rule of thumb is put it in a generalist journal. If roughly equivalent level, generalist or specialty journals, I prefer a generalist journal. But that's not true in every subfield. So this is very heavily contingent. This is where you need to get advice from other people. So there are definitely areas where, like in formal epistemology, I would prefer a solid formal epistemology journal to a solid generalist journal, although I would still prefer a A-level generalist journal to a solid but not A-level formal epistemology journal. So this is all super complicated. This is stuff I can't tell you too much about. You need to get specific advice on your specific situation. I just want to tell you these things exist. You should be aware of them. Other people can help you who work in your subfield. If you want to know about publishing on epistemic value, I can give you all kinds of advice about that. But if you want to know about publishing in history, you need to talk to historians. Even in ethics, I've done some ethics publishing, but you should talk to people who are more ethicists. Here's some things I can tell you about. Some stuff is peer-reviewed, and we'll talk more about what that is. That essentially means you submit the paper, and then people who are supposed to be experts in your area read it, and then they give advice to the editors of the journal about whether or not to publish it. Some stuff is invited, and that's basically you're asked to submit a paper, and it might be reviewed after you're asked, but there tends to be the presumptions that it is likely to get accepted because it's been asked for, and sometimes it's going to get accepted no matter what. And there are what you might call service publications. Service publications are like book reviews, encyclopedia articles, stuff like that. It's, I guess the kind of like reductive way to put it was like, you're not really doing philosophy for yourself in these, although you kind of are. Like book reviews are often engaged in some kind of like criticism of the book, but it's largely not doing your own philosophy. It's largely just a thing that's a service to the profession. These book reviews are helpful for the profession. Encyclopedia articles are helpful for the profession. My advice is don't do service publications until you have tenure. Definitely don't do service publications until you have a job or literally you have nothing else you could possibly do. That service publications are a ton of work. They are zero prestige. You are never going to get a job on the basis of your service publications unless you are exactly tied with somebody else in every other respect and you have more service work. Even then, I'm not sure that would help you. So do not put your effort into service publications. Other people may disagree, this is my opinion, but I think the evidence strongly backs me up. Service work is not going to help you and it's a massive time suck. I say this as somebody having written 2 book reviews, which I regret. Do not write encyclopedia articles, by the way. Absolutely even worse. Okay. So what's going to get you a job is peer-reviewed stuff, much less so invited non-peer-reviewed stuff. That's much less prestigious. So if you get invited to submit something, Yeah, good for you. That's cool. That first of all, you should feel good about it. Somebody thinks you're good enough to invite you to submit. And if you have a paper you can't put anyplace else, go ahead and give it to them. And there's some cases where there's very prestigious invited venues. You should ask for advice about that. As a general rule of thumb, if you get invited to give somebody a paper, if it's a good paper, don't give it to them. Publish it in a journal. Journal publications, peer-reviewed journal publications in a decent journal are going to be way better for getting jobs as a general rule of thumb than invited work. This, by the way, is a real problem for philosophers from underrepresented groups because they get invited to submit all kinds of stuff. So if you are a woman, you're more likely to get invited at your career stage to submit stuff for good reasons, right? Diversity is really important, and you want diversity authors in your anthologies. So you need to invite women to submit. And if you're getting invited as a woman to submit, you're good. That's great. You should feel good about that. You should not be embarrassed. It's not be like, I'm only getting invited because I'm a woman. You're getting invited because you're good, but it's a bonus that you're a woman. But women get invited to submit a lot of stuff. The rare philosophers of color apparently do too. And it's hard to say no to this kind of stuff. And you'll see when you start looking at the CVs of people who are applying for jobs, is that the philosophers from underrepresented groups have way more invited stuff, and actually it can make it harder for them to get jobs because it doesn't show that they can publish in prestigious venues. So you want to be very cognizant of that. It's not like you should avoid it at all costs, but it is a cost to give someone invited things. It's a publication you can't get in the thing that's going to be better for you. So it's just something to be aware of. Generally speaking, and again, I'm only going to say this about 10 million times, get advice from people you trust. And then also it can be very helpful to emulate other people who've been successful. Don't emulate people who've been way more successful than you could possibly be right now. Elizabeth Anderson is an amazing philosopher. You cannot emulate Elizabeth. You're a grad student right now. You cannot emulate Elizabeth Anderson yet. Eventually, I hope you can emulate Elizabeth Anderson, but you certainly can't do so now, right? So look at people who have the jobs that you'd like to be in, that are sort of, again, not full professors, not people with endowed research chairs. You're not there yet, but people sort of like, oh yeah, that's this place I could see myself in a few years, and I'm ambitious to go towards. Those are people who look at their CVs, see where they publish. People who work in your area, stuff like that. Where are they publishing? And then that should give you a sense for where people who are respectable in your area are publishing, right? That's a good kind of like place. If you're like, I'm not sure what to do, look to people who you can see yourself as, they're sort of the best versions of yourself, and then do what they did. That is a generally good piece of advice. Don't compare yourself so much to people who are so fancy that you're going to feel like garbage all the time. This is a mistake I have made my whole life. I lucked out. I went to a school that ended up being very fancy. That wasn't fancy when they admitted me. It got fancier as I was there. And I was like, oh, Jesus, everybody's so amazing. They're way fancier than I am. And I just felt like trash all the time, even though I was doing okay, right? You got to like moderate that, but you definitely like looking at people around you for cues on what to do is very useful. All right. The mechanics of submitting, again, a lot of you probably know this, but this is for people who don't. You will this is for peer-reviewed journals. You will send them a paper. There are some formatting restrictions, but most journals have very loose formatting restrictions for your first round. If it gets accepted, you'll have to reformat it to the journal's requirements. Different journals are more or less annoying about this. Some journals are like, no, you have to change all the spellings to English spellings before you submit it the first time. And then some journals like, do whatever the hell you want, we'll make you reformat it later on. So go check the journal website to see about that. Sam.
Yeah, I have a question about this. So Bob Pasno once told me, and he emphasized very strongly, it was his considered opinion that you should not format toward the journal's settings, and I don't. And I'm curious, have you, Brian, as a referee, ever thought?
No, never in my entire life.
Okay.
But you will get journal. So the only thing that really matters is word count. I do pay a lot of attention to word count. Sometimes, by the way, word count means word count including references, sometimes it doesn't. So that's the one I pay attention to. When I was, young and nervous about this, I did what the journals told me to. Now I just send them whatever I have. once in a while, if it's easy to change, I mean, I don't think any journals that I submit to have very strict formatting guidelines.
I have had journals send it. So the Journal of Ethics, and I think this might be like a publisher level thing.
Yeah.
They'll send it back. And it's
Yeah.
happened to me several times where I'm like, okay, I'm just not doing this. I'm going to submit somewhere else.
Yeah. So yes, so just check what they do. If it's super restrictive, you will ask somebody for advice. If you're like, my God, I have to rewrite my whole paper now, ask somebody for advice. It's almost never that bad, but there are some places, at least there were 6 or 7 years ago, that asked you to use like UK spellings for everything. That's an easy change to make. And I think maybe Phil Studies wants you to use A4 paper size. Anyway, whatever, that's easy. There's nothing worth spending. If you're spending more than like 15 minutes reformatting things, go ask somebody if you have to do that. So don't worry too much about the formatting, worry about word counts. Places will reject on word count. So take that seriously. You'll probably need an abstract. They have strict word counts for the abstracts. Some places won't even let you submit it if you go over the abstract word count. That's all. So write an abstract. Make your abstract interesting. I, by the way, as a referee, will never read an abstract. I've never read an abstract as a referee, and I never will. But I get referee reports where people are like, I want you to change your abstract. Actually, I'm very helpful, by the way. I've gotten great advice on abstracts from anonymous referees, by the way. So you will need an abstract, write one, make it interesting. How long is you ask me for specific advice on all these things if you want. How long is the refereeing process? Depends on the journal. People are trying to make it shorter and quicker now. So like I'm reviewing for Episteme and they said 6 weeks, they asked for 6 weeks or maybe 4 weeks. I'm reviewing something for Mind right now, and I think they asked it back in 2 months, maybe. You'll get places that are like, we want this back in 4 weeks. Don't say you'll do this if you can't do it that quickly. Then you'll get places that don't tell you. But look, it's not that surprising if it takes 3 months. Beyond 3 months, it starts that you can email and ask, but you should budget like probably 3 months for a round of refereeing. This is important, by the way, when you're budgeting your time, because you need to say, okay, this is why Sam said you're not going to get 5 publications in your we're not getting publications in your last year. Yeah, because look, you're going to send it someplace. It's going to take them 3 or 4 months to get it back to you for the first round. If you're lucky and you get to revise and resubmit, I'll explain what that is in a second, then you're going to need to change it and send it back to them. It'll take another few months, right? By the way, I've had plenty of things take 6 months, a year. So I've had things take 2 years, but that's very uncommon. 2 years, 1.5 years, whatever, a long time. So that happens sometimes. So if you get a paper accepted, it's going to be, we have 3 years. 3 years that's ludicrous. It's going to be, if you're lucky, 3 months for the first round. Then you're going to have to spend some time revising it, which is going to take you like a month, and then you're sent it back. So like if you're lucky and it gets accepted, from like the day you submit it to the day it's accepted, if you're lucky, it would be like 7 months. So you just can't expect to crank out a bunch of publications in your last year at grad school. You got to get the process started early. How often are papers accepted? I have a link right here. This is a bunch of data on different journals. It varies, but not very often is the short answer. So like at the upper end, like the most prestigious end is like 4%. At the less prestigious end, I don't know. But in the middle, that's probably 20% at the most. I don't know. Actually, someone should check that out. But for B tier journals, it's got to be less than 20%. This is why you're not going to be lucky and send it the first place in your last year and get accepted. It's going to be, you're probably going to send it to a few places. Well, I'll show you my CV of rejections in a little bit. I have 65 rejections, by the way. So I'll show you my CV of rejections in a bit. I say that with a smile on my face. I did not smile for any one of those rejections, even a little bit. Should you start by submitting to the best journal? If your paper is good enough to get into the best journal, then you should start by submitting the best journal. If it's not, don't waste your time. I can't give you better advice on that. Don't overshoot and don't undershoot. You should appropriately shoot. How do you know what appropriately shooting is? You need to get advice. I can't tell you because I haven't read your paper. when I read your paper, which don't all of you ask me to read your papers, but if I read your paper, I could say, oh, this is my guess on where it could go. Will you ever be able to tell where it can go? Yeah, when you're done a lot of this. For the first time you publish, or the second time you publish, will you be able to tell where it's going to go? No, you'll need to talk to people who know better than you because they have way more experience. I'm at the stage where I kind of, as I'm writing a paper and towards the end, I'm like, I kind of have a sense where this might be, but I always ask other people. You definitely need to ask other people. And you don't aim too high because you just don't have the time, right? If you spend like 2 years getting rejected from all the top 5 journals, and you knew that you couldn't get in there, you just wasted 2 years of your life, right? But if you submit to a good paper to like these like C- tier journals, well, you just wasted all the time you spent writing it because you're not getting the credit you deserve for the effort you put in, right? For the quality of your work. And so this is an area where we really need to ask other people and start and think about it and listen to what they say and ask a bunch of people. Don't just ask one person. What are desk rejections? Sometimes you'll send a paper to a journal. The sub-editor for your area will read it and say, this is not worth anybody's time, and they'll just send it back to you. That's a desk rejection. It's not worth sending out to referees. It happens sometimes. It happens to the best of us. There's desk rejections, and sometimes you'll get rejections without comments, which is where they send it to a referee, and then the referee rejected it. And some journals don't require referees to explain why they reject things. So sometimes you get rejection and no explanation. If it's real fast, that's a desk rejection. If it's not real fast, it's probably a referee rejected it without comments. This is just these things happen. If you get like a bunch of desk rejections in a row, you're probably aiming too high, or there's something really wrong with how you're framing what's going on in your paper. And so then ask for advice ask someone to say, hey, is this paper am I just being too ambitious for where I'm sending this paper and that's why it's getting desk rejected? Or is it that I'm not explaining why this is interesting and so the editors can't tell that it's worth anybody's time? I think I got a desk rejection once because I misspelled Aristotle in the first paragraph of my. That's my guess, by the way. There might have been a lot of other reasons, but I did in fact misspell Aristotle in the opening paragraph of the paper. What are revise and resubmits? So this is the thing that you should feel very good about if you get one. So you send it to a journal. The journal sends it to the referees. The referees say, hey, this could be publishable. It's not publishable as is. Here's the things that would need to be fixed. And if these could be fixed adequately, we would say publish it. That's a revise and resubmit it. You get sent back. Some journals do what's called reject and resubmit, which is they say, we will not publish this paper as is, but if you fix it and resubmit it, we will consider publishing it. That's just a revise and resubmit. I don't know why they do it differently. So if you get the paper back and they say, we're not publishing it, but you can send it back to us if you like, that's a R&R. And you should feel great. If you get just accepted if someone just says, no, we're publishing it, oh my God, wow. It has never happened to me. It has never happened to almost anybody I know. It's almost always, well, it needs some work, but if it works out, that's a great thing. You should be proud of that. You should feel very good about it. It's pretty likely that those will turn into publications. Not always, sometimes it doesn't happen. But it's pretty likely. You should feel a lot of hope. I mention this because I've met people who in grad school were like, oh, I just thought that meant the paper is bad, so I didn't resubmit it. I'm like, oh my God, anyway, Alex?
I was just going to ask if sometimes papers get desk rejected because of fit with the journal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. So yes, just as a way of softening a desk rejection.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Or they might have published a paper that was on a very similar topic too recently. It kind of depends on what you work on. But if you work on something that's a little bit specialist and they've just published a paper on that, even if it's a different thesis, but on that topic, they might think, oh, we can't publish 2 papers on something super specialist that quickly. That happens sometimes also, I'm told. I've never been an editor for a journal, so I've never done desk rejections, but these are reasons I hear. Who referees your paper? I will speak as someone who's refereed, I don't know, 100-ish papers, a lot of papers. I refereed 14 or 15 papers last year. Maybe one of them was a book, I don't remember. Anyway, I referee a decent amount of stuff. There are plenty of people who referee more, but I referee a lot. So this is where I'm coming from. Who referees your paper? It's going to be people who the editors of the journal think are qualified to referee the paper. Sometimes what happens is they'll send it to somebody and that person says, I can't do it, but here's somebody I think could do it. So it's either the referees thought you were the editors thought the referee was qualified, or somebody else told the editors that the referee was qualified. The people are often experts in your field, but they're often not experts on what you're writing on. This is important to acknowledge. They're often experts in the very broad subfield, the broad field that you write in. So what do I referee in? So I write on epistemic value a decent amount, and I do get papers specifically on epistemic value. Good, that's an area I work in. I get papers that are on things I wrote a paper on once 5 years ago, sometimes. I get papers in epistemology very broadly, even in areas of epistemology that I do not specifically work in, but I'm somewhat qualified. I guess I'm an epistemologist, so I'm roughly qualified. I get stuff in applied ethics. I've got papers on stuff where I definitely got it because almost no one works in that area, and they had to find someone who had some vague competence in it. So I'll just mention in philosophy of games. Not a lot of people work in philosophy of games. I'm known to a bunch of people as having played a lot of video games. And so I'm pretty convinced they're like, shit, we have nobody to send this to. Brian played a lot of Halo in grad school, so he's more qualified than most people. So is that the way it should be? No, in the perfect world, it would all be the foremost experts in your field, but that is not possible. We don't live in that world. So it's gonna sometimes be people who are like, a referee should say no if they don't know what's going on. And I will say no to stuff where I'm like, there's a very deep literature that I'm not familiar with here. But if I'm like, I judge myself to be adequately familiar with the relevant literature, where I wouldn't have to go read a bunch of stuff to understand what's going on in this paper, I will accept the referee request. That's important because it means if you're writing to an audience, if it is inaccessible to people who are not like the world's foremost expert in that field, the referees aren't gonna understand it. You don't need to write for like the average philosopher on the street also, but it needs to be accessible to someone who is competent in your area of philosophy, but hasn't necessarily kept up with every cutting edge paper that you've kept up with. You might need to tell them a little bit of stuff that you know, but they don't know. Sam?
I've only refereed a very few papers, but I know in at least one case, a journal asked me to referee a paper on a topic that I was just the most recent person in their journal who had published on that topic.
That happens.
Do you think that's common?
I don't know if that's common. It wouldn't be surprising because it's like, well, they know that you're qualified because you published a paper in their journal on that, right? When you submit to a lot of journals, they ask you to fill out what you work on, like a little kind of form saying what you work on. They often use that to pick referees. But yeah, so if you talk to journal editors, they're desperate for referees. They get tons of submissions and there's not enough referees. And so they will use just a wide range of heuristics. Yeah, people who publish, they keep kind of lists of people who they know to be good referees on certain topics, but they can't go to that well too often, right? And so they just use all kinds of tactics to try to find people who might, and it often is just asking people, hey, who might be able to referee on this? And this is why it just can't be that it's going to be the expert on this. So if you're writing on whatever consent, it's not always going to be that, you're getting the world's people who write mostly on consent as your referees, because they're just not enough of those people who referee all the papers on consent. So you're going to get people who work in ethics more generally, or people who work on autonomy, or people who work on justice or whatever, right? People who are like qualified enough. This is the way it has to be given sort of the constraints of the discipline. So just kind of be aware of that when you're thinking about both how to interpret referee reports and also sort of how to write. So how long do referees spend refereeing? I can only speak for myself and the people I've spoken to. So I'm only going to speak for myself and the people I've spoken to, which is a decent number. I read threads online and stuff like that about people talk about refereeing. So my understanding is that I'm not atypical, but I'm just going to tell you that. So and you're going to be upset at me when you hear this. So I'm not going to apologize. I'm just, this is the way it is. When I get a paper, I'm told how long I have, and I will pick a time in my schedule for when I'm going to have time to referee it. And when it comes time, I read it once. I think about what I think the paper is trying to say. I try to explain the paper back to myself. I try to kind of think about like what the argument is. And then I go back and reread just the little bits that I need to reread in order to understand the things that I think are important. So sometimes that means rereading half the paper. Sometimes it means rereading a couple of sections really carefully. If there are parts of the paper that I don't think are particularly important or I'm not too worried about, I just skip those. If I'm like, oh, this is, yeah, I get why you would worry about that objection, but I can't take that objection seriously. I just skim that section. So I'm really focusing on what I consider really philosophically important or what I'm qualified. Sometimes I'm like, I'll say to the editor, look, there are areas of this I'm not qualified to have an opinion on. So I'm going to focus on these areas. Hopefully you find another referee who can speak to that, the technical stuff, for example. So I read it once. I think about what I think is how I understand the paper, and I'll kind of explain it to myself, take a bunch of notes. I'll go back and reread the parts I need to really evaluate and think about the things that I consider important and contentious. I write some notes to myself. I figure out what I think, and then I go back, edit it, and send it. So it's like basically a day, but not a whole day. Like one day is reading, one day is thinking and writing up my notes, and then a day of editing. And this is definitely not 3 whole days. It's like a couple hours, a couple hours, a couple hours. By the way, referees don't get paid for or compensated in any way, shape, or form. There's no professional benefit to refereeing, and it's all professional costs. I'll just mention that as an aside. So before you think too badly of us. But this is relatively typical, as I understand it. Don't expect referees to read your paper 20 times. They can't. They can, but they're not going to. I'll also mention as an aside, I almost never read people's footnotes unless I really feel interested in whatever, in the sentence where the footnote comes at the end. Don't put anything interesting in your footnotes. If someone needs to read a footnote to understand what's going on in your paper, absolutely do not put them in the footnote. I mentioned that because I know a lot of grad students do that. I did that all the time as a grad student. Sometimes if you really want someone to know this in the footnotes, I will have a parenthetical saying, if you want more on X, go look at my footnote. Because I'm like, a lot of referees are like me. So the referee is going to put some real time and thought. We do put time and thought into it. I really think hard about the stuff I referee, but I don't have all that much time. And so you need to kind of keep that in mind when you're writing. And by the way, look, if you're writing papers that no philosopher can understand without reading it 6 times, no one is ever going to understand your paper because you're not famous enough for anybody to want to read your paper 6 times. I'm sorry, that's just how it is, right? So forget about just referees. This is like, the referee's putting more work into understanding your paper than almost any reader ever will. So you need to keep that in mind when you're writing. And then you get a report from the referee. You'll usually get a report from each referee where they kind of justify their verdict. And then you're going to get either rejected, most of the time. That's the most common one. You get an R&R some of the time, and then very, very rarely, it's never happened to me, you get just an acceptance. And there's a lot we could say about how to deal with revise and resubmits. This is a thing where I think we don't have time to get into this. You can ask me afterwards if you want. But if you get an R&R, go talk to your advisor. You should, first of all, have a little party. Good for you. You feel great. I feel great about every R&R I've ever gotten. I'm so happy. Then go get some advice about how to deal with this specific stuff. You'll need to make a bunch of changes, and you'll write a letter to the referees where you say, thank you very much for all your effort. Everybody does it. You're supposed to say it. And then you explain what you did and didn't change and why. You don't have to make every change they suggest. If you don't make a change they suggest, you got to tell them why. You got to say, this is a great change. You're the most amazing person I've ever met. But I didn't make the change, and here's why. I often don't make changes referees suggest, but I need to say, look, here's why. I didn't have the space to do this. I didn't have the space to do this. But you mostly are gonna you're gonna try to do what they ask, because they usually is good advice. And even if it's not, as long as it's not terrible advice, you want to get that paper published, and so you want to make the referees happy. And then that's what your letter does, is you explain why they should feel good about what you did. All right. So here's, I just kind of went through every referee report I have. I've done this for every time I've done the publication workshop, so don't feel like I did a crazy amount of work, but I went and updated it since the last year. And I figured out a rough characterization of why I reject papers. By the way, I should say, I, like every referee, mostly reject papers. So most of the papers I get are rejected. So number one, this is from most at least common. It ignores some relevant literature that I expect that like most of the interested readers will know about. This is not like it ignores the literature that I know about. Not like, but it's like, who do I think the audience for this paper is? What do I think most of them are more or less aware of? Are you, the author, aware of that stuff too? Well, of course, if you're not aware of it but didn't matter, then I just put in a little note, hey, maybe you should have a footnote about X. But if you're like, oh yeah, this paper that you obviously haven't read or you never mention, like completely rebuts every point you've made, and you don't even mention it, yeah, okay, I'm going to reject that paper because it says to me you haven't done your basic work, and I don't think it could be, I'm like, I don't see any evidence that can be fixed, right? You'd have to rewrite I don't see any evidence that you have a response to these problems that are well known in the literature, because if you did, I assume you would put it in, right? I assume you're not even aware of this, and that's why you submitted this in that form. That's like the number one problem I see. Number two is like essentially novelty. Someone else has already said basically just this. Or you're saying something, you're taking an idea someone else had, and you're just kind of applying it in a way that I could have done or anyone else could have done. This is I'll mention, this is all of this stuff is very sensitive to what the journal is. So I recently refereed something for a fancy journal, I don't remember which one, where I was like, this is a good paper. It's not novel enough for this journal, but it should get published someplace. And which I stand behind that verdict. If you're going to have tiering, novelty has to be sort of part of how you do these, put things into categories of goodness, right? And so I was like, yeah, what you're doing, what the person's doing in this paper is taking an idea that is already relatively well known and showing how it applies to a particular problem, and someone need to do that. It's worth doing. It's a valuable contribution to philosophy. But it wasn't that hard. And someone should publish this, but it should not be like a top 5 journal, right? And that's not an uncommon thing. You see, I get the kind of feedback from referees every so often. They're like, this is interesting, but not interesting enough for this journal. So in the same with like, hey, the higher you're aiming, the more I expect you to know, right? So yeah, novelty is really important. But again, as you aim lower and lower, novelty becomes less and less important. But it still needs to be somewhat novel. Weak arguments obviously really are bad. So this is super common. You're arguing with some people and they're all going to reject your premises and you haven't told them why they shouldn't. So you're like preaching to the choir, so common. People are like, oh yeah, the people who don't already believe me aren't going to believe me, but I don't care. Like, well, I care, because what's the point of writing this paper otherwise? The people who already believe you don't need this argument, and the people who don't believe you aren't going to be convinced by it. So now I don't expect that you need to change everybody's mind. That's like way too ambitious, but you should try. I should be able to think that somebody could have their mind changed by this, or at least come over to your side a little bit more. If I read this and I'm like, no one who already wasn't on your side will be even a little bit swayed, that's not, in my opinion, a publishable paper. And then, or they're like, say something that's not like going to be disputed by the people they disagree with. It's just kind of a surprising claim or a weird claim or kind of, oh, I don't know, I've never thought about that. And they don't back it up at all. And nothing in the paper suggests they can. And usually I'll reject, because I'm like, well, like you need to write a whole new paper to back this up, and it doesn't. Nothing suggests that you can do it. So my standard for rejection is like, I just can't see that it's likely to be fixable. And again, it's sensitive to how good the journal is. Sometimes I'm like, well, I can't see this be fixed, but I don't know, give it a try. I'm curious. So this is going to be, but again, the bigger point is, hey, back up what you're saying. Yeah. Ambiguity is bad. Ambiguity where anyway disambiguating is bad. And then again, saying nothing surprising or criticizing one of like 6 arguments for a view. And I'm like, okay, but what about the other? Like, sure, that argument doesn't work, but there are 5 other ones. Is that interesting? This is also kind of journal sensitive. At a really good journal, I'm like, that's just not that interesting. Like at a lower level journal, I'm like, oh, I don't know, that's interesting. If it's an argument that like everybody endorses for that view, that also could be more interesting, right? So a lot of this is like context sensitive. If you criticize a view no one holds, I don't find that particularly compelling. If you're straw manning the other side, the view you're criticizing, I'm not going to accept that paper. Big takeaways. What I do is when I referee, I think, who are you talking to? Who is going to be interested in this paper? Have you said something that they've learned? Have they learned something from your paper? That's what I'm looking for. I will referee papers that I'm like, this is the most boring paper for Brian I've ever read in my entire life, but I know who would find it interesting and they would find it really interesting. I've accepted those papers. I'm like, I wish I'd never read this paper, but I can definitely see who liked it and it's great for them. I've accepted those papers. So none of this is, I'm trying not to take it personally. I'm like, and if I just had a paper accepted where the referee is like, I would rather eat my foot than accept any of your premises. But I can definitely see that other people would accept them. They didn't say that literally, but they said that pretty close. I would rather reject everything there is about epistemology than accept your premises. But you know what? I can definitely see other people accepting these premises, and so I'll accept this. So it's not like, does the referee love your papers? Who are you talking to? Are those people worth talking to? And have you taught them something important? Have you shown that you are having a conversation with them, or is there all the stuff that they know about that you're not aware of? That's going to be, that kind of stuff. So I expect you to be in a dialogue with some significant range of philosophers about something worthwhile, and you're going to be saying something that they're going to find interesting. That's roughly what I'm looking for. How do you know if your paper is good enough to submit to some particular journal? You need advice about that. This is really important. There are things that are not worth your effort because you have limited time and you need to put that time and effort where it's valuable. Sometimes you will think something's worthwhile and you'll get into it and it'll turn out to be not worthwhile. Some of those things you should have known in advance not to spend your time on, but sometimes you don't know until you're kind of halfway through. Sometimes you, and by that I mean me, will write an entire paper and then you'll say, oh my God, this is not worth publishing. You need to cut your losses sometimes. Or sometimes you'll send things to journals and you'll like eventually realize that the amount of work, given the referee reports, the amount of work I would need to put in to get this published anywhere after I got it rejected a few times is just not worth it. And you need to make those decisions. You need a lot of advice, but you need to be willing to stop working on something sometimes. Don't stop working too soon, right? Don't give up before you've even tried or before you have evidence that it's not worthwhile, but don't pursue projects that aren't valuable, right? That aren't going to get you anywhere. And this is partly a thing that you need to seek advice on. All right, let's talk about dealing with rejection really quickly. And I'm going to share my CV of rejections. Did I just closed it? I'm an idiot. All right, give me 2 seconds here. Sorry, I just got habitually open and close windows. Kind of was like a nervous twitch. Where is that? My research. All right. So, no, it didn't work. Let's try that again. Okay. I just saw this TikTok about professors on Zoom, and then it was like trying to share their screen, and it was exactly what I just did. Oh well. All right, so this is my work in progress spreadsheet. So on the spreadsheet, I have everything I'm working on right now, everything I've ever had accepted, and then a bunch of stuff on hiatus, which I only keep around because it's interesting. I like tracking this stuff. So everything here is a place that's been submitted to. And then everything that's not in this column, well, everything that's not in black and boldface is a rejection. And so 65 rejections. And some of them, a lot of rejections. I think this is what, 8? I think 7 or 8. I have a couple of 7 or 8. And some of them I eventually put on hiatus because I'm like, oh, well, eventually I'm turning this into a book now because I'm like, I can't get it accepted in a journal, so I'll just write a book about it instead. Turns out getting books published is easier than publishing journal articles, they say. But some of the ones that got someplace got rejected a bunch. I didn't like it. I still don't like it. I went 3 years before this. I went 2019, 2018, 2017, nothing but rejections. A lot of journal rejections, a lot of conference rejections, grant rejections, all kinds of rejections. I got told by a place where I worked that they'd rather hire nobody than hire me. Bunch of stuff, didn't feel good. I can say that with a smile on my face now because otherwise I would just cry. But it does not feel good. I will say the first time I got a paper published at a good, like a really respectable journal, I cried for about an hour. Just like I literally was like, oh, I guess I'm not the worst philosopher in the entire world. And that was such a sense of relief that I just totally bawled. So I don't like it. I don't have great advice about how to deal with it. You're going to be upset about it unless some people aren't. I don't know. Some people are tougher than me. It's going to happen and it's going to be no good for most of us. It's not okay. You're unhappy. Like that sucks. And that's not okay. To be, like it sucks to be unhappy. Being unhappy is bad. And you shouldn't feel good about it. It's not, I'm not trying to say it's okay. You shouldn't be mad at yourself for being miserable about being rejected. It is okay to be unhappy that you're rejected. It is not okay that you're unhappy, again, because unhappiness is bad and it's not okay that people are unhappy. But it's not like you should feel bad about yourself for being unhappy. That is, you should be unhappy. That is the fitting attitude to take about rejection. And you shouldn't beat yourself up for it. And you shouldn't expect yourself to get over it too quickly. And if you do expect yourself to get over it too quickly, you will just make yourself more miserable and you won't make any progress. Now that said, you shouldn't wallow and you can't be miserable for like 6 years about every rejection. Don't do that, that's unreasonable. You need to find a way to live your life and to be unhappy about being rejected, but to get over it eventually and be able to move forward. I don't have great advice. How you do that is different for different people. When I get the email, the first line tells me I'm being rejected. I don't read anymore. I'm like, I can't believe how stupid they were. That paper was great. Referees are the worst. They probably didn't even read it. Blah. I say whatever I need to say. I'm upset about whatever I need. I give myself some time. I sometimes will not look back at the email for a week. Or I'll read the referee report and be like, what the sorry, I probably shouldn't swear on when I'm being recorded. I will swear a lot. I'll think that's ridiculous. How they totally misunderstand me. Often I'll go back and reread it down the road and I'm like, oh yeah, totally. They were right. But whatever. But I give myself that leeway to be angry. I take the time that I need. I don't think about it for a while. I do all that stuff. If I need to cry, I do. I sometimes do. It feels bad. If you get enough rejections in a row, it feels real, real, real bad. If I need to think for a while that I'm just the worst philosopher that ever lived, you got to think those things. You got to do those things. You got to be who you are. At some point, you got to stop being as upset about it and move on. And you have to have your techniques for dealing with that. But you need to budget that time. I got this from Lisa Meraki, when she gave a talk here. Such good advice. She's like, that is part of the process of writing philosophy, is feeling bad about philosophy, feeling bad about yourself. That's part of the process, and you need to budget that time for your process. If you didn't budget time to read the relevant research, you're not doing it right. If you don't budget time to be upset about rejection, you're not doing it right. Schedule that in. And that's important because if you treat yourself like a robot and you're going to budget your time for like what a robot would do, you're not going to be successful, because every time you're not a robot, it's going to totally ruin your schedule, and then then you're not getting ahead. So budget the time to be miserable and go ahead and be miserable about it. Also, I want to mention, you're going to hate your papers. Maybe not. You know what? Awesome. If you don't hate your papers at any point, that's rad. Good for you. I'm so jealous. But if you were like everybody else I know, you will hate your papers at some point. Absolutely guaranteed. So I will use Julia as an example, even though she's not in the room. Very often, Julia says to me, Brian, I've worked on this. I just think this paper is such a waste of time. I'm like, this never is. She's great. and the papers will get in fancy places, and all the fancy people will be like, will tell her how amazing she is. But everybody does it. You get to a point where you've thought about it too much, and you are so bored of it, and you think, and you know it so well, you're like, everybody knows this, and it's such a freaking waste of time. Everybody feels that way. Now, maybe your paper's terrible. I don't know. I haven't read it. But that is not diagnostic. The fact that you hate your paper at some point is completely uninformative. Ignore that. Let yourself feel that way. It's fine, but ignore that. Find a cheerleader. Sam and I were talking about this. You need to have some friends that you can go and curse all the referees at and just say, oh, they're the worst. I hate all of them. You need those people, and who will cheerlead you, unconditionally say you're amazing. You need that stuff. You also need people who will tell you to your face when you're doing a bad job, blah, blah, blah. You need that stuff too. But you need to find some people who'll be supportive for you. You cannot be supportive enough for yourself. You will not support yourself well enough if you're a human being like most of us. Find people who do that work for you. Eventually, you need to go back and read the feedback. Referees have valuable feedback, even if they totally misunderstood your paper, which they do sometimes. That's kind of often your fault. Not always, but often your fault, and you can learn a lot from that. So you need to get used to taking that feedback and really benefiting from it. You're going to want to ignore it, but you'll get a lot from it. But give yourself that space. Don't immediately try to deal with it immediately. Give yourself the space to be miserable. Come back when you can read it more charitably and really think about it. Again, sometimes you should ignore what they say, but even if what they say is wrong, the fact they said it is often very informative. Lewis Powell has some nice stuff on this, by the way. I would take a look. Google Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell has some nice stuff about that. Okay. Really quick writing advice. Just from the perspective of a referee, know what your paper is trying to do and tell your readers very explicitly what your paper is trying to do. Know what your arguments are and be very clear about what your arguments. This is very common for me when I referee a paper. I will write their argument so it's logically valid. And I'm like, oh, well, you require these two assumptions, but you never mention in your paper and you do not support, and that's where all the problems are. And I'm like, I wish you had made your own argument valid, and then you could have backed up the assumptions you need. Be clear on what you're arguing and how it works. Know why your paper matters. And you should be able to explain to your audience, you should explain to your audience why it's worth their time and energy. Be very clear who you are arguing with. Engage with the motivation those people have, not just what they say, but why they said it. This will make you a better philosopher. Be charitable. They might be refereeing your paper. No one likes to hear their ideas butchered. I think it's better. You need to argue with people, but it's important. But often you want to present yourself as arguing with positions, because people come and go. They'll die someday. Positions are always there, right? So saying this is the view, and here's some people who have it. So it's like we should take it seriously. But this is the view I want to argue with. That's going to make your papers much stronger, in my opinion. Lots of caveats, obviously, blah blah blah. Famous people, for various reasons, you have to talk. You have to engage with them. If you do history, it's different, et cetera, et cetera. And again, be very explicit what the value of your paper is. Don't say things you don't need to say. Don't make stronger claims you can back up, because referees will get annoyed. I'm the best referee in the world. So I will say, oh, you made the stronger claim you needed. I will only evaluate the weaker claim because I'm a sweetheart. But a lot of people are like, nope, that's wrong, and you are rejected. People will get caught up on things. Don't have anything for your referees to get caught up on, right? Don't have anything that grabs their attention that doesn't need to grab their attention. This one is real hard for, I think, early career people. Don't argue for things that don't need to be argued for. This is like when people will often say a paper reads like a grad student wrote it. Often what they mean is they argued for every single freaking thing in the world, or they defined every term in the world. Like, oh my God, everybody knows this. That's hard to know when to argue and when not to argue. You need advice on that. Not everything you say needs to be backed up. And you won't know early career what that is, and you need to get a lot of help with that. I don't like exegesis unless that's what the paper is for, because it's, again, exegesis is understanding what people think. And I want to know about positions generally. That's more my preference. Think about conditional theses. Those are really useful, which is like, if X is true, then Y is true. I don't know if X is true, although it could be, probably is, hopefully. Don't pick if X is true where X is obviously false. That's interesting. It's trivially true. But saying, hey, I'm not going to show you that Y is true. But it's interesting enough to show that if X is true, Y will turn out to be true. That can often be very interesting. Not always, but it can be very useful. And so if you can't prove Y, often doing these conditional theses is definitely worth publishing in many cases. You're going to work on a lot of negative papers, especially early on in your career. That's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. But they become more interesting if you can draw a positive lesson from it. This is what we learn from the failure of this view or this argument. That's make your paper way more interesting. Finally, rationally allocate your time. You didn't need to hear that. You knew that you should be rational. But I really want to emphasize, put your efforts where they're worthwhile. And you're not always going to know where they're worthwhile. And so get advice about, hey, how likely is this project to go someplace valuable? Get advice about that, and try to like take that advice. Okay, that's a lot. Alex.
Oh, I was just gonna say about the conditional theses that I was talking to Renee, and she said, so even if the antecedent is implausible, it could still provide a modus tollens for people who aren't sympathetic. So it can be interesting in that way too. So
yeah, and say that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like,
yeah,
hey,
definitely.
if X and Y. Yeah, I happen to think X is plausible, so I like this. But if you don't, then you just this will give you an argument against it, maybe. Yeah. I have this paper where the referee was like, I'd rather eat my foot than agree with you. The referee said, you might mention that as like if people really don't like your view, this shows them what they have to deny. I'm like, oh yeah, fair enough. Yep, so I put that in. Great. All right, questions?
I've published nothing. That might not surprise you. I think the biggest barrier for me right now is knowing like when I have a publishable thought. Any advice on that?
You should get advice from people who know more than you do. I really, that sounds super glib, but there is just no one, like, man, if I could explain to you in like 2 minutes how to know what's worth doing in philosophy, I would be a way more famous I would be a famous philosopher. Not a famous philosopher. I don't know. I don't like. It's heavily discipline contingent and blah blah blah. And sometimes there's two things. If I could back this thought up, would that be worth publishing? And then how likely am I to be able to back that thought up? Those are two different questions, right? How much work am I going to have to do? That's the third question, in order to get to a place where people will think that I have backed that thought up sufficiently, right? So they're just areas in which the amount of work you would need to put in to be able to convince someone that you had something worth saying is massive. And if the chance that you have something worth saying is sufficiently low, I wouldn't, unless it's your dissertation, in which go for it, right? But if it's like, oh, I'm going to try to write a paper on this, but it's not going to be my life project or my project for the next few years, probably not, that's not the place to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my advice is write down every single thought you've ever had and put it someplace. I would put on your computer someplace, clearly labeled. And then when you have time where you're like, okay, I'm going to start a new project, you can look at the things you've thought and think, okay, which of these are likely to pan out in terms of I can back up what I'm saying sufficiently, and would be interesting enough if I could back up what I'm saying, and are not, and how much work is it going to be, and then try to balance those things out. But all of those are things that you're going to need advice on from people who know those areas better than you. So really this is find people who are trustworthy. It's going to be other grad students, professors who work in this area at CU, professors who work in this area outside of CU, and balance the idea off of them and see what they think. That's my advice.
One thing, at least in my own experience, I feel fortunate to work in an area where, the risk of someone having already said it is pretty low, because applied ethics is a really young field. And I think, at least if you work in applied ethics, it's not hard to find applications of already thought about concepts to new examples. And in that sense, I think you can find maybe not is my argument publishable, but like, is there nothing written on topic X? It's just a lot easier to do in some areas of applied ethics than in like, epistemic justification or something like that.
Yeah, some of it's doing the due diligence and kind of scanning some of the literature to look at the Stanford Encyclopedia and stuff like that, and get a sense of if this is a thing that's been talked about, right? But yeah, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that like my biggest worry about something like that is that it would just turn into one of those things that the reason nobody said it is because anybody could say it, is I think what you had on your handout there. So it's like, it's like you want to say something that nobody said, but you also want to say something that people are gonna be like, oh, I should have said that. So
yeah, this is, again, there's not a simple algorithm. It's really where you need to get advice from a few other people. Do they find what you're saying interesting, provocative enough? How much engagement would you need to do with the literature? That kind of stuff. Yeah, start talking to some people. I want to say, by the way, Sam gave the advice that you should think of every seminar paper as a possible publication, and that's 100% correct for two reasons. One, because it might be, that's great. Now, they're not all going to be publishable, because sometimes you're going to write it up and then it's going to turn out that you get the feedback, which is like, hey, interesting, but the amount of work you would have to do to make this idea publishable is like, it's 6 months of work or whatever, and you don't want to spend 6 months on it. So sometimes, or your professor will be like, oh, it turns out someone's already argued exactly this, or whatever, right? So sometimes they're not going to be publishable. Not every seminar paper can be published, or it's not worth the work, right? But some of them can, and you won't know in many cases until you try, or at least write the paper. But why would you practice not writing? Why would you not practice skills you need for publication? Evan, you're nodding because I already said this to you, and I already said this to your whole class in my seminar.
Because it's true.
But you should always practice writing papers for publication in the following sense. You should use the skills that you would need to use if you were to write a publishable paper. So you should always practice the skill of thinking about why what you're saying is valuable, and not writing about stuff that has no value.
Right.
Like that's and justifying to other people why it's valuable, and giving enough arguments that could convince people to disagree with. These are all the skills that you should be practicing. First of all, this is just good philosophy, but also you need to work on that. Everybody, this is not stuff that's we're naturally good at. And so practicing that for every one of your seminar papers means you're going to produce some stuff that's publishable. But great, that's really important. Even when you don't, you will have developed your skills. Sam, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I didn't do that when I was doing coursework, and I regret it for sure, because I just wrote all sorts of useless papers and now they're useless and it was a waste of time. So
yeah, totally. It's a bummer. And like in some sense, the structured grad school rewards you for that, right? Because you're often encouraged to like pick one article that your professor happened to assign and then say, oh, let me write a criticism of one of the premises in that, where you're like, that paper is not that important to almost anybody except the author and the person putting in the syllabus of your class, but you don't know that, right? And so grad school can encourage you to engage in the stuff that like the discipline doesn't value, and that's for a lot of reasons. No, you can't blame your professors always for that, but so you want to cultivate like the sort of start thinking about it in that way. And again, if you can't think of anything worth writing for your seminar, you just got to write something, sure, but you can at least practice the stuff that's not worth publishing. You can still practice those skills, because that'll make you a better writer and better philosopher.
Yeah, and maybe this is more controversial and mercenary. In about year 2 of grad school, the classes that were just so far out of my area that there was just never going to be any connection. Like, I'm sorry, the early modern philosophy class, which is cool, and like I love early modern philosophy, but it was like in the weeds, intense, Descartes and Spinoza. I just thought, like, diminishing marginal utility, I am never going to teach this. I'm never going to write about it. I have an undergraduate understanding of it. I'm going to write a paper that I can submit about it, and I'm not going to stress about it. And maybe that was the wrong way to do it, but I did a paper for it, and I think I got an A on it. But like, I did not try very hard. And that's not to say it was a bad paper, but it was just like, I knew it wasn't going to serve me in the long run.
You got to do some satisficing to make it through life, right? You got to accept that not everything you do is going to be the best possible thing. And since you can't always do the best possible thing, you got to pick you got to pick the things you do the best possible thing on. Obviously, if you take one of my classes, you better write a great freaking paper. But no, this is a joke. I was joking. Anyway, but yeah, like you're going to have to, you're under a lot of pressure in grad school. And whatever, maybe you shouldn't be, but you are. You got a lot of stuff demanding your attention. You won't be able to maximize you won't be able to do every one of those as good as it could be done. You're going to have to pick and choose where to put your efforts. And again, there's this danger of like specializing way too much, way too soon, blah, blah, blah. People should be decently well-rounded philosophers. The difference between being a decently well-rounded philosopher and being the best philosopher in every field, that just doesn't happen, right? So yeah, I support what Sam is saying here, except not in my classes. That's again a joke. I understand we all need to do that to some extent.
Yeah, the kind of advice that David always gives me that I think is really helpful is to just like, when you're really interested in something, like go with that, because you do have to stick with it for so long. And so if you really hate a topic, like don't force yourself to do a topic if you really aren't that into it, and or if there's something else that interests you more, that you're more passionate about. Like passion does really matter, because I definitely have had the experience of I really hate some of my papers and I never want to look at them ever again, and I'm just like, but I'm convinced though that there is something there, I think, because I'm interested in it. So that's kind of what gets me through feeling like I hate the topic. Yeah. So I think that's like helpful advice that David has given me for sure.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, I mean, there's so much philosophy, and I suppose all of it, but at least a lot of it is really important and could be interesting and it's all interesting to someone. You can't, so it's okay. Like it's okay not to do all of it, right? It's okay to pick stuff that's interesting to you. First of all, because that's how the discipline makes progress. We need people to think about things that are interesting to them. And also it is emotionally, physically, mentally draining to do what we do. And hopefully you at least enjoy some of it, or you don't even have to enjoy it. Hopefully you find it rewarding in some way, or you find it valuable in some way, you get something out of it. So focusing on stuff that's valuable to you is what you should do. And actually the discipline is better off for you doing that. You are actually doing, that is socially optimal in some sense, that we need it. That's how we divide epistemic labor in the discipline. And so, yeah, finding stuff that you're passionate about and pursuing those projects, again, sometimes it can be like 3 or 4 things you could have been passionate about. And some of them are going to get you a better job than others. And then maybe that's okay. Then passion's not the only consideration. But if there's like a bunch of stuff that was all equally philosophically interesting, you're not passionate about something, I wouldn't work on that stuff. Again, unless you're passionate about something that literally no one else in the world is interested in or ever will be interested in, then that can be your hobby. That's not going to be your job. So again, I want to say a lot of this is reporting my experience as a referee and what I do. I think that is reasonably typical, but I'm sure there are all kinds of variation there, right? I think this advice is fairly general, but you need to kind of, again, in different subdisciplines or different field things that people work on, the norms are slightly different, and you need to kind of go and talk to experts. I really, again, maybe that's such a bummer way to put it, but don't trust your own judgment too much. There's ways in which you need to trust your own judgment, and there's ways in which you need to be suspicious. And your sense of what's going to work out for most of us, that's useful, but only to a point. So talking to other people about what is likely to work, what not likely to work, you need to get that information. You need to bounce your ideas off other people. You're not going to do good philosophy otherwise anyway. And then you're going to feel crappy. And you need to not take that as a very good signal, right? Let yourself feel crappy, because that's how people are. You need to do it. You don't feel bad about that. But it is not informative that you stop liking your papers, or that the fact that you get upset about the referee report is not informative that your project's bad, right? The fact that you feel discouraged is not informative that your project's bad. The fact that you sometimes wake up and you don't want to work on it is not informative that the project's bad. Like, we all have that. And you need to find a way to work through it. And there are ways that work for a lot of people, but there's no one size fit all. And then there's going to be a lot of other workshops in which we'll talk. I'll mention, Alex, I think Heather and I are going to do a workshop on our writing process in a couple of weeks. For me, it's going to be very much, this is Brian's writing process. It may or may not work for you, but let me talk about my process.
I was going to schedule another one as well after yours with Julia and Bob has now, just so that we get like the widest range of opinions, because I will say, so thank you so much, Sam and Brian, for doing this. And I will say, like, I have heard from a lot of professors this year or more recently sort of about their experiences or like successful people. And that for me has been extremely, extremely valuable, just like to hear that like you, Brian, have experienced this, you know, like rejection, and like David Boonin has told me about that as well. And that to me, kind of just like the idea that we're all sort of in it together, and that it's not just the fact that I'm a grad student that makes me feel like take it personally when I get rejected. That has been really, really valuable. So I don't know how the department could do that, but it would be really nice if it was sort of just like more out there, but anyway, or like find a way to sort of let early career grad students know that, yeah, like even David Boonin sometimes gets rejected and he has like tons of books published. That was like, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so nice to know that it's not.
Yeah, totally.
So, yeah,
you don't need to keep it to yourself. Like, you don't need to keep it to yourself, right? Because that's part of what makes it so hard, is that you're like, oh, I suck.
Yeah, you're like embarrassed. I'm like, I don't want to.
Shameful.
Like, I don't want to admit that I got a desk rejection, but really it's like an experience everyone has. So it shouldn't be something that you feel ashamed about at all.
Yeah, and again, I want to emphasize it's a bad thing in the sense that it hurts, and that's bad, right? But it's nothing to be ashamed about. It's definitely right. Don't be ashamed about it. You know, you should feel okay talking to other people about it. That's like, this is just how it goes. And Julia's advisor in grad school, I think, never had anything rejected until last year. But that is like the only person I've ever heard of that. All right. And it was funny because he called Julia up and he said, oh yeah, it does feel bad to get stuff rejected. I'm like, God damn it. But you know, that guy's weird. That's like almost everybody, I don't know anybody other than him. We all can tell you, hey, we shouldn't be ashamed about this in front of us, right? We've all sent stuff that's been way ambitious. We've all been under ambitious. Like, we've all made all the different mistakes. We've all had the things that aren't mistakes. They're just bad things that happen because they happen, right? Yeah, you're definitely not alone there.
Yeah, and I think it's hard not to take it personally sometimes too, because we were, you know, it's our papers are closely connected to who we are, and so it's different from like I don't know, more of like a job report or something like that. It's kind of something we put a lot of ourselves into, and so it feels personal when it comes back negatively.
There's a sense in which you shouldn't take it personally because it's not about you personally, but there's a sense in which you should take it personally because the human beings take these things personally. And telling yourself don't take it personally, like when you're taking it personally at that moment, like this is the thing I like. So when I'm upset, I don't want someone to tell me not to be upset. And if you need to take it personally for a while, go ahead and take it personally for a while. Like at some point you need some distance, you need to deal with it, and you don't feel bad if you need to take some time to be like personally hurt. Especially, like philosophy is this massive outpouring of your energy and your attention. It is really personal. Mm-hmm. And so even if it's not meant personally by the referee, it's personal, right? They think you're wrong or that you weren't sufficiently diligent or whatever it was that hurts. Yeah, totally.
Brian, can I ask you an off the recording question? Not that it's inappropriate, it's just like very specific.
Maybe I'll end the recording now since we're over time. So thank you so much for doing this session for us. Thanks.